This is John Nugent.
I'm Sam Long.
And I'm Ron Peters.
Welcome to the After Class Podcast.
Because the best conversations happen
after class.
Welcome to today's episode of the After Class Podcast, coming to you from the After Class studios on the sprawling campus of Great Lakes Christian College here in Lansing, Michigan, United States, planet Earth, Milky Way galaxy, and all of the creation God has made.
That's probably enough context.
All right, appreciate that. I just want to make sure everybody understood where we are situated, where we're located in space and time.
I'm also in a chair, just for future
We're all sitting down here in Ron's office. So welcome to the episode. Today we're going to continue the conversation from our previous episode regarding what the Old Testament does or does not have to say about Satan. In our previous episode, we made the case that many passages in the Old Testament that people have long assumed talk about Satan do not. But there are passages that do, in fact, talk about him. And so we want to take a look at those today and try to determine exactly what they do say and how that informs our understanding of this particular person. So, Sam, I believe you're going to lead us off on that?
Sure. So we begin by understanding that the word in Hebrew, Satan, is not a proper name. It's used in various forms. Verbally, it's used as a noun, but usually when it's used as a noun, it has a definite article as well. So it's the something. Okay. So like you wouldn't come up to me and say, the Sam. So you would say, the intelligent one, or something like that.
Maybe the witty one.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah, we probably should go with that.
But we might say something like the professor.
Right.
Or the teacher. Maybe that's probably what we'd say, the teacher.
Yeah.
Or the sarcastic guy.
So, yeah, that too. So it's not a proper name, per se, in the Old Testament. And so what does it mean? Well, in the verbal form, it has to do with things like basically being against someone. So you see it in different contexts. You might see it in a military context as some opponent, like on the battlefield. You might see it in a legal context, so like your adversary, so the prosecuting attorney, the one who's opposite the defense attorney. Like this is what we're talking about here. And so it's also someone who might accuse. And so then you might call it the adversary, the accuser, the opponent. That's how it's often rendered when it's in a noun form. When it's in a verbal form, it's someone who stands against, someone who is causing problems. So, for example, in Numbers, you have an angel of Yahweh standing in the road to Satan, Balaam, meaning to stand against him. And so that's used of God not being the tempter.
Right.
So that's how it's often used, and that's what we need to come at it with. So I think if we reread a lot of the passages in which we find the actual word Satan, it changes, I think, the inflection of it. And so we need to be clear that from the outset.
Yeah, can I give a few examples?
Please do.
So in addition to the Numbers passage about the angel who stood in Balaam's way being a Satan to him, we have the Philistines in 1 Samuel 29 feared that David might become an adversary to them in battle.
Satan.
That's the word for adversary. 2 Samuel 19, David accuses men of becoming an adversary to him.
Satans.
Thank you. Sorry, we got this. In Psalm 109, appoint a transgressor against him, an accuser to stand on his right. Again, a Satan for the word accuser. So there are multiple passages where this word that gets translated as Satan is used, where it's clearly not talking about the prince of darkness, ruler of all evil forces in the world. Most often in the Old Testament, when the key letters for Satan are used, it's talking about a military opponent or a legal opponent, one who is accusing you in a court type setting.
Okay.
So what we have then, if I can just reiterate and make sure I'm hearing it correctly, what we have is a noun, basically. You have a noun that means adversary from a verb that means someone who opposes, someone who stands in opposition or opposes somebody else. And so it's just a noun that in certain situations gets used as a title, basically, or a way of designating an individual, as we said earlier. So any human agent can be an adversary, a Satan. Any non-human agent can be a Satan. But in some situations, particularly when it has a definite article on it. It could be the adversary, and now narrow it down into a very specific individual, which still could be a human being, but we're going to say, spoiler alert, we're going to say in certain instances it might be Satan, this person that people think of.
At a bare minimum, in the Old Testament, there are heavenly satans and there are earthly satans.
Okay.
And so today we're going to focus on two passages that talk about heavenly satans, and Sam's going to lead us off with probably the most famous one from Job.
Right. So this is the kind of the go-to, like where people will go to and say, see, this is how it works. The problem is they don't read it, I think, fully and without that baggage. So if we try to take that baggage away, we turn to Job 1, verse 6, and it says, one day the B'nai Elohim, the sons of God, or the NRSV translate heavenly beings, came to present themselves before Yahweh. So just stop and take a second. So imagine that God is up there. There's this heavenly court. These beings, whatever they are, that's a discussion for another podcast. But they come before God. They're having a little, lunch party, and they're sitting around, and they present themselves before Yahweh. Okay, so that's the context there. And the verse ends, hasatan, ha is the definite article. So the Satan, hasatan, Satan, as in most translations, also came among them. The implication is this figure is one of the heavenly beings. It's coming to the lunch gathering. And
does he have to sit at the far end of the table? Like, does he smell like brimstone and all the other angels are like,
mostly
dude,
sulfury?
Yeah, so he might have to sit at the other end.
I mean, who likes to sit around someone who smells smoky? Yeah. Sorry.
To be clear, no mention of a table in this text. Carry on.
To be clear. So personally, I think the NRSV and most translations they reinforce this by having it capital S-A-T-N, capital S-A-T-A-N. That's not what it says, although they footnote, or the accuser, Hebrew hasatan. Well, don't footnote it if that's what it actually says, but that's okay. Sorry.
So if it was an accurate translation, what would it say?
I would say, and the accuser came to sit among them. Because you can't, transliterating hasatan is not going to do much good, I don't think.
So the accuser.
Right.
And would you capitalize the A?
I would think so. It's a title.
Okay.
And that kind of makes sense because, in a way, that would actually help the reader to understand this particular actor's role in the narrative.
Right.
It probably helps people understand, why is he going to do what he does next? Well, actually, he has a title that helps you understand what his function is in this heavenly court.
Right.
Which makes us think there are other divine beings up there who have other functions. Mm-hmm. But the function of this one apparently is to accuse.
Yeah.
Right.
And could there, in theory, now I'm just speculating, but could there have been a heavenly being whose job is to be the defender who didn't make it into the story? But just as a way of illustrating that there may be other functionaries in this heavenly court, in theory, there could have been somebody who would have been his opposite as the defender. So the narrative might have talked about the accuser and the defender.
Yeah. It's interesting that a defender is not mentioned, though I think God functions in that way because of what comes in the very next verse.
Yeah, both here and in Zechariah.
Yeah, which we'll get to in a second.
Yeah.
I think one that we, to get way off topic, in
so soon.
In weddings where there's someone always pulling the bride's train?
Oh, right.
There may be someone up there in heaven doing that for God. It's got a big train.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah. If you read Isaiah. Okay.
With multiple sets of wings.
Right. So back on topic. So then verse 7 says, then Yahweh says to the accuser, I'm going to continue saying that just to keep it in our minds, says to the accuser, where have you come from? The accuser answered Yahweh, going to and fro in the earth, walking up and down it. So apparently this being wanders around the earth. We don't know why yet, but that's his job. And Yahweh's like, so how have your travels been? What have you seen? Okay?
He's like Cain from the old Kung Fu TV series. He wandered the earth.
There are 2 people listening who got that reference. Okay.
And Sam and I are not them.
And they're not in this room. Then Yahweh said to the accuser, have you considered my servant Job? There's no one like him on the earth, a blameless and upright man who fears God and turns away from evil. So now God, kind of acting as a defender, says, okay, you've wandered around. Have you seen my guy Job? Like, he is the pinnacle of what it means to be a God follower and a God believer. Okay, he's blameless, he's upright, etc. Verse 9, the accuser answered Yahweh, does Job fear God for nothing? Have you not put a fence around him and his house and all that he has on every side? You've blessed the work of his hands, and his possessions have increased in the land. But stretch out your hand now and touch all that he has, and he will curse you to your face. The accuser's response to God's depiction of Job is, sure, he's a good guy, but who wouldn't be good with all the blessings? And I think as Christians, we kind of reflect that. Like, it's easy to love God and go to church and do good things when things are going well. But when things are not going well, where's our faith then? And that's his argument. So he's acting in his function. He's accusing Job of being conveniently pious. Okay?
Take away the goodies and let's see how pious he is.
Right.
And could this be interpreted too as kind of a broad indictment of humanity? Like, okay, here's Job, and is the accuser here saying, Job's no different than anybody else. Any human being would do this. So is Job now a representative of humanity in general?
It always struck me that God's kind of the one who picks the fight here.
Right, exactly.
Like, he just jumps in. Have you considered my servant Job? It's almost like he's being defensive. You talk about him in the role of defense. Like, he knows that the accuser has been wandering the earth and checking out how humans live. So he knows what's going to come out of his mouth. They're all awful. They all sin. He's read Romans. He knows that all have sinned and fallen short of God's glory.
I feel like that's not true. But
He's seen a lot of breaking and entering. He's seen a lot of adultery and rampant polygamy.
Violence in the land.
And so God knows what he's going to say before he opens his mouth. He doesn't say, so what do you think of my humans that I made?
Right.
He says, well, have you considered Job? Right. It's like, I know everyone down there is a wreck, but surely this guy.
Mm-hmm. And so the accuser's response is there anyone who's actually faithful to Yahweh because of genuine faith, or is it all based on blessing? In other words, is anyone authentically religious and pious, or are they just attempting to avoid curses by doing just enough so that God blesses them? And so he says, you take all that away, I guarantee he'll be just like everyone else, like you're talking about. The rest of your not-so-good humanity. So Yahweh says, okay, very well. All that he has is in your power, only do not stretch out your hand against him. So the accuser went out from the presence of Yahweh. We know a lot of the rest of the story, which is bad things happen to Job very quickly. His family dies. His goods are taken from him. It's an awful situation, and Job's response is one of faithfulness. So then the story's not over. You move to chapter 2. Seems like another lunch party. One day, the beings coming and they present themselves again, and it's the same dialogue. Where have you been? I've gone around. Have you considered Job? He's great. And then he adds a little bit there in verse 3. He still persists in his integrity, although you have incited me against him to destroy him for no reason. Well, there's a reason, the testing, but nonetheless. Then the accuser answered Yahweh, skin for skin. All that people have they will give to save their lives. But stretch out your hand now and touch his bone and his flesh, and he will curse you to your face. So sure, the accuser says, you've taken away a lot of his material possessions and goods and family, but man, if his body starts failing and you take away, things like that, definitely he'll turn. And so Yahweh says, fine, you can take everything except his life. And so he does. We have the boils and this very awful picture of Job scraping himself with potsherds. Anyone who's had poison ivy knows what that's like.
Yeah.
Or a medical allergic reaction.
No, it's just poison ivy.
It's just poison ivy. Poison sumac doesn't count. Just poison ivy.
Yeah. So in this, what we see is this figure, Hasatan, is doing what he's supposed to do. His job is to make sure that people are actually pious. His job is not to ruin people's lives and get them to go to hell. It's just simply, is this person actually following you for the right reasons? And the best way to tell is to take away those blessings. So that's how he's functioning here in Job. And we could spend a lot of time, I think, unpacking some more of that. But that's the gist of it. All these very malevolent ideas about Satan aren't present. There's no pitchfork, there's no horns, there's no tail, and there's no just trying to destroy people just out of spite and evil. That's his function. That's his job, and it's in his job. His job title is, that's what he does. He accuses. He's an adversary for that purpose, to test and make sure people are actually pious.
Yeah, I think it's worth pointing out. I mean, two things. One, where is this Satan? And he appears to be in heaven with other angelic or divine beings of some sort in God's presence, which doesn't fit the narrative well. That once upon a time, the devil exalted himself, and he was kicked out of heaven, thrown down, so now he's roaming around the earth because he's been kicked out of heaven. In this account, whoever this being is, he's in heaven. Yeah. He's where God is, and he's among other divine beings. There's no account of him being restored to a position in the heavens after becoming a worm in Genesis. But the divine context is presupposed. And I think people just need to recognize, who have a very complex and for them, very clear Satanology, you can't have him kicked out and there at the same time.
Right.
Yeah, he's either been kicked out or he's still hanging out in the divine council. And in Job, at least, this being is hanging out in the divine council.
And to be clear, if it's an evil being, it's not in God's presence. That's not how holiness works. So I think we can safely say it's not an evil being that's going back and forth here.
Yeah, that would be another point of inconsistency, right? And people who hold the view that God is so holy that we can't be in his presence, but they have the devil in his presence, and they think he's the epitome of evil. Yeah,
exactly.
Great point. A second observation I would make is that throughout the rest of the book of Job, there are only two people in the book of Job who were not rebuked. And that is Elihu, who is pretty much ignored. He shows up, he talks.
Thanks, man.
He talks again, and he's ignored. But Job rebukes his wife. The friends rebuke Job. God rebukes Job. God rebukes Job's friends. Satan, the accuser, never rebuked. He's never narrated in the book of Job as someone that God has to put in his place because he's doing what he ought not do.
Yep.
So,
and he's never blamed. He doesn't. There's no culpability seemingly on his part. In fact, it's kind of the culpability is all on God.
Yeah, because the accuser can't do anything without God's permission. He can't just strike Job. God says, "Okay, go ahead and do it." Now he can act, and yes, he's doing it at God's instruction, based on God's instructions.
Yeah. So Job doesn't seem to interact with this being at all, has no idea what's going on. And that's part of the drama of the whole book, is Job doesn't know what's going on behind the scenes. He's just left to try to deal with the consequences of it.
He's trying to make sense of a situation. He doesn't have all the information.
Yeah, something else that jumped out at me, for people who are looking for the accuser in Job to be an evil being, well, look at all the things he did to hurt Job. It's interesting that you read out of chapter 2, it's God who takes credit for destroying Job. Chapter 2, verse 3. There was no one like him on the earth, a blameless and upright man who fears God and turns away from evil. He still persists in his integrity, although you incited me against him to destroy him for no reason. You incited me against him. God is the one who acted against him.
Yeah.
And allowed all this to happen. So God's taking ownership of this destruction. The accuser certainly has a part to play, but not a part that God doesn't share in from his own perspective.
Yeah. I don't want to get too bogged down to it, but it seems like this is God's agent. Because earlier in chapter 1, he said, but if you stretch out your hand against him, he'll curse you to your face. And then God says, go ahead and do it. So he's acting as God's agent.
Yeah. Exactly.
Which, that's uncomfortable for some people. I have to believe.
Yeah, and understandably so. Sure, I understand that.
And that may come back up in the Chronicles passage.
Yep, definitely will.
Okay, so anything else from Job before we move on to another passage?
Yeah, I think we've covered it. But again, if you've never thought of it in this way, reread it, try to take out the baggage and take out Satan and replace it with something else, like the accuser, and read it that way and see if it makes a different nuance to it.
Yeah.
I think you'll find it does.
Yeah.
Great. There's another passage in the Old Testament that also talks about a heavenly being who's referred to as the accuser. And that's Zechariah the prophet, chapter 3. And this is a vision that the prophet has. And here's how it goes. Then he showed me the high priest Joshua standing before the angel of the Lord, and Satan, that's what the NRSV says, but you have the little note. In Hebrew it says, the accuser. So, and the accuser standing at his right hand to accuse him. And the language there, standing at his right hand, I referred to a psalm earlier in my summary of the accuser passages that aren't talking about heavenly beings. Let there be someone at his right hand to accuse him. This is apparently the place where, in the court setting in the ancient world, that's where the accuser stood, at your right hand. So here is clearly a court setting, and there's a court functionary. And the Lord says and so Satan, the accuser, is standing at his right hand to accuse him. And the Lord said to the accuser, "The Lord rebuke you, O Satan. The Lord who has chosen Jerusalem rebuke you. Is not this man a brand plucked from the fire?" So here is God coming to the defense of Joshua. So in both books, God's the defense attorney. And the accuser is the prosecutor in both cases. But it's interesting when you go on in the book. So now Joshua was dressed with filthy clothes as he stood before the angel. The angel said to those who were standing before him, "Take off his filthy clothes." And he said to him, "See, I have taken your guilt away from you, and I will clothe you with festal apparel." And I said, "Let them put a clean turban on his head." So they put a clean turban on his head and clothed him with apparel, and the angel of the Lord was standing by. The interesting thing about this is in this passage, the accuser is totally right. This man is guilty, and God admits as much. He rebukes the accuser, but he acknowledges, yeah, this guy is guilty, and I remove his guilt. He's wearing filthy clothes. Let's take his filthy clothes off. I'm giving this guy a new start. We're putting on new clothes. And now we're going to go forward with Joshua as God's man in Jerusalem, his high priest to represent his cause in the rebuilding project of the temple. So in this account, the accuser is rebuked, but not because he was wrong. He's rebuked because in God's eyes, even though this guy is filthy, by God's grace, I think this is a passage about grace, through God's grace, his guilt has been removed, and he's been clothed, and he didn't do anything to deserve it. God, by his grace, has made this one clean, and so now the accusations are bogus. It's as if this guy never sinned. And so here, another case, translated Satan, divine functionary, in heaven with God, not in the wrong, although in an antagonistic relationship to a sinful human.
Definitely in an adversarial role, as, again, the name would imply. The accuser or the adversary. And performing what appears to be almost like his designated function in that setting.
Yeah, just to add a little bit more, this is Joshua the high priest. He is he's supposed to officiate the cult between Yahweh and the people. And he's standing there and figuratively has dirty clothes on, which represents the sin of the people and the sin of his own sin. And he's perfectly right to say, what is that guy doing coming before Yahweh? Yeah. You are a sinful human. You should never be here. So, it's not as though he was being this mean, cruel being. He's yeah, you are sinful and dirty and should not be here.
Who are you to stand in the gap between the people and God?
Yeah. And, of course, that's, like you said, that's when God says, I'm going to make him clean again so he can perform that function. But, he might have actually been doing, Joshua solid because Joshua could have been smited, on the spot. Not antagonistic, not evil, doing what he's supposed to be doing, which is making sure that basically impiousness, impurity is not associated with Yahweh. In both these cases, that's what he's doing. He's making sure Yahweh's name and Yahweh's presence are maintained holy, and these other things don't come in that are not appropriate.
Yeah, and here I like to bring up with students that, we have a system that's not entirely different from this. You go to a courthouse and there's a trial, there's the defense attorney and there's a prosecuting attorney. And I always ask my students, who's the good one?
Yeah.
And some of them want to say, well, the defense attorney. Well, really? I mean, if that guy just broke into your house and shot your 3 kids, you're on the side of the defense attorney?
Yeah.
Like, the function of prosecutor is morally neutral.
Yeah.
And the function of the defense attorney is morally neutral. None of them is the good guy or the bad guy, or the good gal or the bad gal. The justice system presumes that if you have one agent who's gathering all the dirt, all the evidence against a person, and another agent who's gathering all the evidence that would support their innocence, that an impartial jury will be able to weigh all that evidence and determine whether the person is guilty or innocent. Mm-hmm. And the side that wins is the side that the evidence lines up for. Yeah. And on some days, it's the prosecutor who wins, and some days the defense attorney wins. And it's a breach of justice when the prosecution wins and the defense should win. And it's a breach of justice when the defense wins when actually the person is guilty. And so in our own system, we don't say that prosecuting attorneys are evil people.
Right.
They hate people in the world, and all they want is bad. Why would we assume that a divine prosecuting attorney is somehow inherently evil and only wants what's bad for people? What if in pointing out the sin of Job or the sin of Joshua, he is holding up the possibility that a more righteous one might represent God? It's God's holiness and righteousness that he represents in his function.
Yeah. And when you think about the Zechariah passage, the function of the accuser character is necessary to establish the context for what God does. By him performing his function, he says, this guy should not be here. He should not be performing this function. He is not clean, and he's right, as you rightly point out. Both of you guys point out. He's right to point that out. That's the setup. And that creates now a set of circumstances in which God can act and say, I am the sovereign ruler of all creation, and you're right, he's not worthy, but as sovereign ruler, I can say, take off those dirty clothes, I'm going to clean him up, and I am now going to make him into the man that can stand in the gap between the people and me. And so without the prosecuting attorney there, you don't get the setup. And so he performs a function in the narrative.
Yeah. So in both cases, in 2 out of the 3, there's going to be one more passage where we have Satan, at least translated into English with a capital S as an individual name. What we find in both cases is a court functionary who is morally neutral, although gets rebuked by God because God is going to do something unjust, which is declare guilty innocent. And before we get on God for doing that, that's kind of exactly what he does to us through Jesus.
Exactly.
Declaring us clean when all have sinned and fallen short of God's glory. So there's one more passage in Chronicles. Sam, you want to take us there?
First Chronicles. I got to flip there. I was not ready. I'm sorry. Okay, so it's First Chronicles 21, and there's a parallel passage in 2 Samuel 24, and we can talk about that in a second.
I'll turn to that one.
Yes, I think you should. And it says this, Satan stood up against Israel. You'll find that there is not a footnote for this one because there's no definite article. So it's not hasatan, it's just Satan, which is interesting. Stood up against Israel and incited David to count the people of Israel. So to take a census. So again, there's this, incite. There's the word incited we saw in Job. It's here again.
Yep.
And he says, okay, you need to count the people. Now, are you ready, Ron? What are the reasons why you take a census?
Really, probably
in the Old Testament.
Yeah. it's probably to get a sense of how many fighting men you have in your population. That would be my instinctive response. Now, you guys can, maybe I'm not going where you're going,
That's
but
primary, yes.
okay, yeah, you really want to know how many able-bodied fighting men you have, which is going to give you a sense of your standing army, how many supplies you need, how much grain and things like that you need to get from your people. If you're confronted with another fighting force, it gives you a sense of whether or not you have superior forces. And so my take on it would be this is a military move. This is motivated by military considerations on David's part.
Yeah, and this takes place in the context of a wider story of David and his faith development.
Mm-hmm.
Right, David is a guy who starts out the young boy of David and Goliath, who, when given a chance to wear the armor and wield Saul's spear, he says, no, if I'm going to win this battle against the Goliath, it's going to be by God's strength and not by human defenses or human offenses. And he goes out there, a man of great faith, and slays the giant because God wins the victory for him. And the rest of David's story, if you read, is him becoming less and less a man that he was in that moment, where the more political influence and power he gains, the more he starts to slip and rely on his own strength and use the sword to kill innocent people like Bathsheba's husband, Uriah. And so we're reaching a critical point in the narrative where this is kind of like David's test. Are you the David of Goliath who relied on God and not his military strength? Or are you this warrior king who is so good at it that he doesn't really need God's help?
Is he becoming a king like the nations around them?
Yeah.
You know, is that part of what the author or compiler of this is saying? Oh my gosh, we're starting to look like the nations around us again.
Yeah. So that's why you take a census for taxes, but also for figuring out how many fighting men do I have so I can calculate who I can beat up. And which, again, God's the one supposed to be leading the battles and fighting for them, not military strength. So that's the temptation out there. Do you have trust in God or not? And we'll see by whether you say, I don't need to take a census. We got God on our side.
Yeah.
So he incites David, and David says, yeah, we need to go do a count. So they take the census.
So it's the devil doing this. Right? Satan is the one who incites David to do this, the way Chronicles reads.
Right, and it puts it out there. David still makes the choice. All right?
Yeah.
So verse 7, God was displeased with this thing, and he struck Israel. And David says, I've sinned by doing this thing, and he prays, and God gives him you want this punishment or this punishment? Yeah. Like we do with some kids. And so Dave's like, hey, you pick God, because that both sound pretty bad. Like, okay, we'll go with pestilence.
Spun the wheel, right? It's like in that Mad Max movie.
Yeah, he chooses to suffer at God's hand rather than external military.
Yeah.
Right. He'd rather throw himself into God's grace, thinking that God's punishment would be worse. Turns out maybe he chose the wrong one in this case.
You chose poorly.
Yes. So just to sort of recap, David is incited by this figure who now has dropped the definite article to Satan. And the response by God shows that David is the one in error. The Satan is not rebuked for it. The fact that David chose it displeases God. Doesn't say that God was displeased with Satan. He's displeased with David for making this poor choice. Maybe before we go too much further, we'll compare it to 2 Samuel 24. Same episode from there.
Yeah. And before I read the Samuel passage, I just want to say the way Chronicles reads it, if this is the only version of the account, you would say, here is Satan being Satan, like tempting David to do this awful thing. Here is the deceiver who is bringing down David and his kingdom by interfering in this way. And David would have stayed strong. He would have never thought of this if it wasn't for the devil made him do it.
Right.
David, a victim in that reading.
Yes.
But here's how 2 Samuel 24 reads, verse 1. And the anger of the Lord was kindled against Israel, and he incited David against them, saying, go count the people of Israel and Judah. Mm-hmm. So, same account, parallel version. This is the Deuteronomistic historian.
Probably earlier writing.
Yep, writing earlier.
Chronicles.
And Chronicles is retelling the same story, But he changed one significant detail.
It's kind of important.
In 2 Samuel, God is the one who incites David to take the census. And this to me feels like God telling Abraham, go sacrifice Isaac. It's a test.
Sure.
You know,
yeah.
where is David's heart at? Is he still the man after God's own heart that trusts in God to win his victory? Was he an in God we trust king?
Well played.
Or is he a king like the nations? And so if you're reading Samuel, you just don't even think about Satan.
Right.
Because he's not even mentioned.
Yeah.
And yet then in Chronicles, the same account is given and Satan is used in the place of God. So how have you guys heard this discrepancy talked about?
I remember when I was a student here at Great Lakes, when I was taking an Old Testament survey class, the way I heard it reconciled was, since Hasatan didn't have the article, we shouldn't read it as the same individual we encountered in Job or Zechariah, but it is merely an adversary incited. And so it could have been David facing one of his neighbors and the potential of an invasion or something like that. And so...
Could be a military adversary, another nation, another
exactly.
king.
Yep. A human agent that maybe is being used by God, but it was basically, we shouldn't translate this as Satan. We should just translate it as an adversary. And that would be a little bit better, because we can interpret it as God using this particular neighbor military force as a way of testing David. So that was the way I heard it reconciled.
I'm okay with that to some extent, because I think translating as a proper name just doesn't seem to be the way to go in all the Old Testament. That's just not how it's being used. So doing something else seems to be a better way to go than capital S Satan. But anyway, and all of it, there's also the idea of progressive revelation and understanding more about how things work. So in the same book of Samuel, you have an evil spirit from God came upon Saul. How does that make sense? Why is God sending evil spirits? That's not in God's character. And so here, like, maybe the writers of the Deuteronomistic history just saw God, like everything is in God's hands. As time moves on, like, well, maybe there's an opposing force out there. And so that's why Satan comes along in Chronicles, a later writing. Now they're understanding the spiritual world differently. That's also something to be considered as well.
So coming from a similar time as Job or maybe Zechariah, that there's somewhere along the line the prophets or scribes, whoever in Israel, have begun to go, what about this adversary person? Mm-hmm. And maybe we should see this person as being more directly related to what happened in what we read in Samuel. And so, 100 years, 200 years later, whenever these things were compiled, put together, just a different understanding of the nature of the invisible world.
Yeah. It removes the culpability from God, puts it on this other figure.
Yeah, and that may be a way of protecting a certain image of God.
Sure.
That God is too holy to get his hands dirty. That he would not be the one to put the idea in David's head to do something sinful. God could never do that.
Right.
And of course, then they go to the New Testament. God doesn't tempt people, right?
Right.
And so maybe so another explanation is that this is a theological cover-up. Mm-hmm. Right, to protect God's character. God can't do that to David. And of course, with the analogy we made to Abraham, he's already done something like that earlier on in the story. But as an explanation of what might be going on, it is interesting. Chronicles was written very late. Mm-hmm. And we don't know the exact date of when it was written, but it was written a lot closer to the Christian era than most of the books in the Old Testament.
Right.
And there is a book written probably later than that called Jubilees that's in the Old Testament pseudepigrapha. It's not among the books of the Bible, but it's among a Jewish text that was a highly prized Jewish text, especially among the Dead Sea Scroll community, the Essenes. There are lots of copies made. And it's interesting, Jubilees retells the story of the book of Genesis and a big chunk of Exodus. And what's interesting in that retelling is in most of the places where something fishy is being attributed to God in Genesis, Jubilees inserts mastema. which is the Jubilees name for Satan. And so when Abraham is tested to take Isaac's life, it's Mastema who puts the idea in his mind. And when Moses is on his way to tell the Israelites to rebel against Pharaoh and leave and come worship God, in Exodus, his story is told as if God was going to kill Moses on the way because of something to do with not circumcising his son. But in Jubilees, it's Mastema was going to kill Moses. Mastema is the death angel who killed the firstborn of the Egyptians. And so you do have a Jewish book in the intertestamental period where there's some sanitizing of God's image. The things in the Bible that are attributed to God are now attributed to a Satan figure. And so one of the theories is Chronicles is a similar account where something like that's going on. So an evolution of Jewish thought to put some distance between God and activities that we think God is beyond.
Okay. Makes sense.
So that's another explanation.
Yeah. Regardless of the reason, there's, again, no seeming rebuke of the Satan figure. It's all David's fault. It's David's fault for failing where Job may have passed. So Job continued to remain faithful, whereas David says, "Oh yeah, I don't trust this God anymore. We need to trust on our military power." And that's the point of the episode, is like this plague comes because of David's unfaithfulness in requiring the census.
Yeah. And whether it is another king that God uses to incite David, or whether it's an angelic figure that God uses to incite David to take the census, God is still the one.
Yeah.
And at this point, it would fit the narrative we've seen in Zechariah and in Job if you took the maximalist interpretation that it was a divine being who is now Satan with a capital S.
Right.
That still this Satan is on God's payroll doing God's bidding.
Right.
Yeah. Yeah, his function in the Chronicles text is consistent with what you see in Job and Zechariah. And I think it is the more modern Christian view of Satan that makes that hard, that makes that Chronicles passage hard to read, because we see it in conversation with Samuel and go, oh my gosh, what's going on here? But yeah, if you just understand the function of this particular character in the Old Testament, again, Job and Zechariah, his function there, then I don't think there's any incongruity between the Chronicles and the Samuel reading of it. It's just that the chronicler has said, oh, by the way, we understand this a little bit different now, and we're seeing this character as being God's agent to bring this about. Or, it's, as we've already said, it's just possible that that's not even the case. It should just be read, an adversary, and take the name Satan out altogether.
Yeah. So I think we've gone through all the passages
I believe so. There might be
in the Old Testament that are most often used to talk about Satan and the origins of Satan.
Yeah, I think so.
And we found the three primary ones that don't use the word Satan, and read in their context, they don't appear to be about Satan.
Yep.
We're talking about the previous podcasts with Isaiah and Ezekiel and so forth.
That's
Yeah.
right, and Genesis. And so in this episode, we've talked about three passages where Satan language is actually used. And we do have a divine type being, an angelic type figure who has an accusatory role, who stands as an enemy of a person of God, but not necessarily, or not at all, an enemy of God.
Right, yeah.
Seems to be doing God's bidding,
Like you said, on the payroll.
but in a very negative relationship to the human. And that's the Old Testament background
That's it.
Yeah.
that we take with us into the New Testament, which we're going to have to do in a future podcast.
Correct.
And then by way of preview, I think that, John, what you said there is going to be really important for understanding the evolution of the sort of theology or Satanology that we see. That he's not God's enemy, but he's the enemy of God's people.
I don't know.
Or
maybe,
maybe I don't want to say the word enemy, but adversary. I should
Right.
probably say that he is the adversary of God's people. Maybe I should say it that way.
If he's going to be the enemy of anyone, it's the enemy of the believer who's not a true believer, who is not truly faithful and truly pious. That's who he's the enemy of. But what he does is show that you are, in fact, an authentic believer. And so So his function is to do that. And so the only reason you're an enemy is because you're not what you say you are.
Okay.
You're a hypocrite.
All right.
That's who he's the enemy to, I think.
Okay.
Well, this will be very interesting to see how the New Testament verses factor into this. And we're probably going to get into a little bit of intertestamental background.
Yeah.
When we jump into the New Testament, a lot has happened between Chronicles and Jesus.
Several hundred years, a lot of Israelite history.
And there's some evolution of Jewish thought on spiritual beings, including Satanology. And so we'll give a little bit of background to that, and then we'll jump into the New Testament and say, let's carry the Old Testament image forward and see how that can serve as an interpretive lens for interpreting what we find in the New Testament. Using Scripture to interpret Scripture, not using Dante's Inferno or screw tape letters to interpret Scripture.
Right. Iron Maiden album covers.
Or Looney Tunes cartoons, which have a lot of Satanology in them.
They do.
Oh my gosh, yeah, for real. The Far Side cartoons.
Well, thanks for joining us for this week's podcast, After Class Podcast, because
the best conversations happen
after class.
This is Mike Harrison, Academic Dean at Great Lakes Christian College. This podcast has been known to cause stomach discomfort and heart palpitations, much like an exam from one of our Bible theology professors. Listeners do so at their own peril.